In the heart of Hartlepool is the award-winning historic Quay, a faithful reproduction of an 18th century seaport, portraying what life was like in the era of Nelson and Trafalgar. The buildings provide an appropriate setting for HMS Trincomalee, while shielding her from the gaze of the general public. Within the authentic shop fronts, you can find a printer, swordsmith, gunsmith, naval architect and naval tailor. The centre of attention is undoubtedly the Nelson-era warship HMS Trincomalee. Due to a great shortage of wood in England, tenders were sought in Asia, where there was an abundance of good quality wood. In May 1816, work began building the Trincomalee in Bombay, India, under the master shipbuilder Jamsetji Bamanji Wadia. The timber, mainly teak, was brought in from the nearby forests of Malabar. On October the 12th, 1817, amid great celebration, the Trincomalee was launched. She was the 12th of 47 Leda-class frigates. Ironically, as she was built to fight the French, the class was an exact copy of a captured French ship, the Hebe. By the time Trincomalee arrived in England, the Napoleonic War had ended, so before she could be put to work, she was surplus to requirements. She was demasted and towed to Portsmouth harbour, where she sat until 1847. After major changes to her armament, she was finally put to work, 30 years after her launch. In May 1897, the 80-year-old ship was sold for disposal and breaking, but fate had another destiny in store. HMS Fodroyant, once Nelson's flagship, but by then a privately owned training ship, had recently been wrecked in a storm off Blackpool Pier. Almost immediately, Trincomalee was purchased from the breakers as a replacement. Trincomalee was renamed Fodroyant and started a 90-year career as a nautical youth training ship. After the war, by 1986, Trincomalee's days as training ship Fodroyant had drawn to a close. Then, in 1987, an opportunity had arisen to transport the ship from her berth of 55 years in Portsmouth back to Hartlepool, and so started the £5 million restoration, which results in the magnificent ship we see today. Life on board a 19th century frigate would have been extremely hard. Lack of home comforts and strict discipline aside, it was the sheer logistics of accommodating so many men in such a small area. The Trincomalee has 3 decks, the upper, the lower and the orlop, plus a quarterdeck and forecastle, which today are joined to form another complete deck. The white canvas area to the left used to be open to the elements, the only cover being the ship's boats which were stowed here. Forward of this is the forecastle and bowsprit, with an 18-pounder bow chaser cannon on each side. The most important part of the ship is the quarterdeck. Even though it was fully exposed to the weather and enemy fire, it was the nerve centre of the ship. From here, the commander and officers directed the ship during both voyage and battle. 2 sailors steered the vessel using the huge wheel. Defending the quarterdeck were a combination of 18-pounder cannon and smaller 12-pounder cannonades. Dozens of handmade replica cannon now fill her decks, just as they would have when she was on active service. Each are complete with heavy carriage, pulleys, shot and gunner's tools. Mixed amongst the cannon are these powerful short-range cannonades. The wheels and large screw behind the barrel allowed the weapon to be brought to the correct bearing and elevation much more easily than the heavy cannon. Masting or stepping a sailing ship was an art form in its own right. The centre or mainmast was manned by elite members of the crew, the top men, who would scurry amongst the rigging, adjusting the trim of the sails to maximise their ability to catch the wind. The total area of Trincomalee's sails when set was 18,320 square feet. The gun deck, with its 32 18-pounder cannon, was the key to a frigate's fighting ability. Moving the guns into loading and firing positions by muscle power alone was a back-breaking task for each of the 9-man crew. In the heat of battle, the gunners would endure thick smoke and intense heat from their own cannons as well as enemy fire. The gun deck was also the location of the captain's great cabin, a relatively enormous space given the cramped confines allocated to the rest of the crew. The captain was emotionally isolated on board ship, having to distance himself from the crew to maintain authority and discipline. While he had more space than anyone else on board, his was also in some ways the most enclosed part of the ship. The barley twists in these rails just forward of the great cabin was the trademark of master shipbuilder Jamsetji Bamanji Wadi's Bombay shipyard, and identifies the Trincomalee as one of his ships. Also on the gun deck, adding to the smells and smoke, was the galley. You could have anything you liked, so long as it was what the chef made. The Navy promised 3 square meals a day, and that is exactly what they delivered. From this great stove, all of the crew were fed. Despite popular belief, sailors of the day were very well fed and remarkably healthy. The lower deck, known as the mess deck, was where the majority of the crew would sleep, eat and relax when not on duty. Conditions were not what you could call luxurious, especially with over 200 men sharing this one large space. The enlisted crew were packed together like sardines when sleeping, with only 14 inches of shoulder space allocated to each. Hovering just above the mess tables, their coarse hammocks were often shared, normally after a long day of manual labour and without any washing facilities or change of clothes. The officers were placed at the stern of this deck, with their own wardroom and tiny cabins for privacy. The officers ate in a more civilized manner than the rest of the crew, although space was still limited. The table arrangement wasn't usually this grand. The restorers have set the table as if for a special occasion, such as Trafalgar Night. At the bottom of the ship is the orlop deck, which was used for storing everything from sails, food, water, clothing, personal possessions, to powder and shot and rum, the latter with a permanent marine guard. This morale booster was placed on the gun deck, and thanks to the restorers of Hartlepool, not only will Nelson be remembered, but so will HMS Trincomalee.